Hi, good morning. This is video log entry 161. It's about 8 a.m. CST. So I finally fixed my issue, which was a Segfault that I mentioned yesterday, and actually it was a lot simpler than I originally imagined. I thought it was something to deal with me going outside of the boundaries of predefined variables that I established on the heap. So I thought it was an error invoked by my sprite function because I invoked, or I created a dynamic array. If you guys don't know what dynamic arrays are, they're basically arrays that are on the heap as opposed to on the stack, because dynamic arrays don't have a fixed size and you can change them by reallocating them on the heap. So you initialize them by having a pointer through malloc, if you've ever heard of that before, which stands for memory allocation. It's initialized through having an initial size as well. And what I did was I didn't do an allocation during the, I could actually have it in the main function, but I had it in the sprite function. And I mean, it doesn't really matter because it's eventually going to be invoked when a sprite is added. And of course the sprite's going to be added for the rudimentary game that I'm making, because it's going to have a standard player character. So that's, I don't know. It doesn't, that's just kind of like stuff that doesn't really matter much. It doesn't really matter where you put it unless you want it for readability. So maybe it would be better to put in a main function or a handler function. So I don't know. And I was thinking about the design as well, and I said I was going to use the entity component system, and it differs from the entity component system. Well, the entity component system differs from object-oriented programming because it doesn't do inheritance. Object-oriented programming is a bunch of classes with inheritance, and there could be classes that come from another class. So that's why you have you can call them supersets or whatever. And each of these objects have their own methods that they can use, and when they inherit from another class, then that means it can also call those particular I call them handler functions, which is fine, I guess. I guess that's a good way to say it. I've used a lot of object-oriented programming for when I was in college and whatnot. That's the only form of design patterns that we used back then. So I decided to try a different design pattern. It's called the entity component system, and the main thing that, again, like I said, it differs from object-oriented programming just because it doesn't use inheritance. So you basically have raw data, and this raw data is modified. It could be global, it could be within a function or another part of memory, but this raw data is modified by the system or game logic. They call it system, game logic, handler functions, I usually call them that. And they also have an entity attached to it. The reason why you have an entity attached is because in games you have sprites, and these sprites could have an ID. So basically, when you initialize a sprite, and from the design pattern of an entity component system, it's going to initialize an ID. So therefore, you can tack components to the initialization of a sprite. It won't be under the same structure, but they are kind of glued together through having a component ID, or entity ID, sorry. That's what the entity is it has an ID. So that means, let's say you initialize a sprite, you have an ID, and then it will call health, it'll call a bunch of other stuff. I don't know if you have maybe like an attack. So that means it would also call that, and you can modify its quote-unquote attack by iterating it, as it levels or whatever. So then all that's going to be tied to an entity ID. And, once the game gets bigger, you can have different kinds of enemies. You could have, like, I don't know, like a brute versus, like, a orc or whatever. I don't know. That's, like, from Lord of the Rings, I guess. Brutes, those big guys with the clubs. And then, like, of course, you have orcs that are just, like, kind of lower-level enemies. And, of course, brutes are going to have a higher attack, but they're going to have a different ID. Now, due to these kinds of enemies, you'd want them to have the same kind of ID because they'd all tie to a brute. But maybe no, I'm wrong. Sorry. The each initialization of a brute would actually have different IDs because you'd keep track of their health and whatnot. So you'd probably be doing something like that. And so that's basically what entity component system does, and that's how it initializes those sprites, which has a component, which is the data, and then the entity, which is what identifies that particular sprite. Now, of course, it's not just that. You can attach it to, I don't know, like if you have a shooting, I don't know, like what do they call it? Bullet hell games. I think those are what they're called. So if you have a bullet hell game, these bullets would also have identities, and they would have another entity, and each of these bullets would also have an entity ID because they're going to be in different parts of the map each time the game is updated. So you would obviously want a different component ID because it's going to be iterating over the modification of the location of that bullet, and then it does like a collision detection of some sort. So if it hits an enemy, of course you wouldn't want it to hit allies or whatever. So of course it would only be comparing to the enemy list, which is why you'd probably want to have like a list of enemies as opposed to a list of allies. And then so allies and enemies, right? For a standard video game, it would be futile to of course iterate over a list of allies. So you'd iterate over a list of enemies, and each of these enemies will have their ID, of course, because they have health and all that, and they have their own unique components or characteristics. What's another word? Attributes would be a good word. So that's why bullets would also have their own attributes as well, because it could be a kind of bullet. It could be a stronger bullet that does more damage, so you'd also have like a damage number tied to that entity component, entity ID, and then you'd have the location of the bullet as well, and then it has a particular size for collision detection. Some could be bigger than others, so you have to do that as well. So they'd have like a rectangle, or you could use different kinds of collision detection shapes or whatever. I'm probably going to keep it as rectangles for a while before I get into more complicated things. And of course I haven't implemented this, I'm just using my imagination to understand what an entity component system is, and that's what I'm assuming it is. And now these entity components, I guess you'd probably have them under like globals, because these components could be structs and whatnot, and you'd probably just have them listed there, and that they'd be externed because you'd want maybe they wouldn't be externed. I guess they would, because you want main and also the handler subsys processes. I don't know, I'm still trying to imagine how I want my layout to be, and I may just do a simple handler function C file as opposed to having subsys then handler functions, or I could just do like I don't know, I don't really know yet. I don't know, this is all new to me, and I'm just going to keep experimenting until I have something that I find to be comfortable for me. But I may just have a handlers function and then a handlers, because I'm not going to have a lot, so I'm probably just going to have a handlers function or file, and then C file, and then a handler's header file, and the header file will obviously contain everything, and then you'd have your globals, which would be standard subsys data, like the size of the screen, where the center of the screen is, because maybe you'd want to initialize the character to be at the center of the screen. Those are just important things to have just in case. You have the position of the screen as well, where it initializes to. I have mine defined to random, I guess. There's just not a particular place in which my screen is initialized during the initialization of my game. And anyway, so, and that would work well with the entity component system, because you'd have your handlers, which are the system stuff, and then you have your components would probably be under globals, and then the initialization of certain identities. I don't know how I do that, but or entities or whatever. So I think under the ECS, they're all kind of seen as the same thing. They're all just data, it's just raw data. So you basically have raw data and them connecting to each other in some way. So yeah, which is fair enough. I'm just thinking. I think it'll work for that. I may just try this because I've done object-oriented programming, and this will be my first project using ECSs, and ECSs are good for bullet hell games, even though I'm probably not going to do a bullet hell game, but I mean, I haven't done enough to even decide what I want to do. So we'll see. We'll see. I think that's a good explanation of ECS. I don't know. Maybe there's a better way to do it, but there's not a lot of literature on it because maybe there's more than I imagine, but it's kind of a niche subject because the entity component system was actually designed from I don't know who designed it or who was the first to use the entity component system, but it happened to be better than object-oriented programming in particular cases where there's a lot of data to handle because and it's more it's easier to deal with when it comes to debugging, and supposedly I wouldn't understand all the use cases for it. But inheritance can be annoying with debugging because you have to go up the inheritance ladder to understand where the issue is to begin with, whereas any component systems is just data, it's raw data, kind of like segregated from each other and connected, glued together through a entity ID, which is fair, right? Yeah. Seems interesting. So yeah, I'm probably going to do some collision detection stuff today, and I'm just gonna mess around with standard rectangle collision detection. Basically, I'm probably gonna play around with the screen, and then I'm gonna make a list. I may just have my initialization, my dynamic arrays for enemies and allies, just to do that to begin with, and then I'm going to look at the standard collision stuff, play around with enemies, and maybe I'll do some projectile stuff, and I'm gonna first at least test the collision with the border of the window, and that's very basic rectangular logic. If you do I don't know, if you look at my game is actually looking at it's tracking. Is it tracking the center? Do I have the center of the rectangle? I think it's like the top or something like that. I forgot. I think it's the center of the rectangle. No, I think my rectangle is actually for Rex. I think it's just the top left corner. So you would actually have to do collision detection in relation to the top left corner, meaning that, if you have the top left and you're looking at a collision at the top, then you would have to, again, like I don't know why they flip the axes like that, but it's X positive this way, Y positive this way. So that means the negative is this way. So that means if, Y is less than 0 because that's negative, that's above the screen, then you would actually have to mitigate what I'm assuming is that you would first update the variable for the position of the rectangle for that sprite, and then you would actually compare it to see if it's negative or not for the top, and you would make it just go back to that position. So you do like a conditional if rect dot y in this case, because it's there, it's at the top, and then if you're looking at the bottom, if you're comparing the bottom to the bottom of the screen, then it would be rect dot y plus, because it's going down, plus the height of that rectangle. If rect dot y plus the height of that rectangle is greater than the bottom of the screen, which is going to be of course it's greater than the height of the screen, then it would just go back to the position it was before each time, and that would be within a key event press. So you do the key event press, it modifies the position, and then it checks that condition. And then if that condition is, you'd probably also look at the difference between the two. So it would be the difference of rec dot y plus the height minus the height of the window, and then it would just go back by that much. So I mean, it would be a minus that whole thing. So yeah, I mean, that's just the top, and then it would be the same thing for the left and the right of the screen as well. I don't know. Usually I can think in my head through those kinds of things, but it's easier to write it down just so I know I'm doing the logic right in my own head, because yeah, it can be kind of confusing, especially when it's the top left corner of the rectangle and you have to do all the manipulation in your head to understand where the position is in, from that relative position of the rectangle, right? So yeah. Anyways, yeah, it's kind of interesting logic, and rectangular logic is obviously very easy to do in comparison to stuff like circles and I don't know what other. I mean, there are plenty of different shapes and whatnot, but yeah, I mean, I don't know, like when they do collision detection for 3D games. Oh shit. Oops. I was cooking something. I totally forgot to turn off the burner. But yeah, so yeah, I mean, for 3D games, I think, of course, you're comparing. I don't know, when you look at different services for 3D games, are very complicated because you would have to call the, what do they call that actually? Triangulation? I think they call it triangulation. So you'd be looking at a triangular surface, and it gets really complicated because you have, like, especially if they're smaller 3D objects, and you're looking at like the average of that surface in comparison to the other. So you'd have like an average somewhere, which would be that surface. Maybe, I don't know, if it's like a curved surface, you'd be taking a flat surface and then comparing it to another flat surface and saying, having, well, I mean, if there's any kind of, I think what you do is just look at any kind of intersection involved, and then it would probably just recorrect it to a flat surface touching a flat surface, and that would be the average of it. And of course, you'd want it to be pretty accurate. So these triangulated surfaces would have a pretty big average, because the more and more pieces you have, I don't know, if you look at averages, and you'd want more for there to be a better sample for that average. I guess that sounds about right intuitively. So you'd have a pretty, I mean, obviously you wouldn't want it to be too long, because then you would be comparing it to another, maybe, I don't know, like surfaces. 3D surfaces are very complicated. They could be jagged in one area, and then I don't know, it's weird, and I'm sure there's a lot of intricate stuff that I'm unaware of, obviously, because I've never done any kind of I've never built a 3D game engine and whatnot. So it seems interesting though. Yeah, so that's what I would assume, is if you take that surface, and if these planes are intersecting, which are the averages of those two triangulated surfaces, which is obviously like the sprite versus the actual environment or the terrain or whatever you want to call it, then of course intersection would just it would do the same logic. For me, I'm just looking at not intersection, but what do you call it? It passing it, or be some number being bigger than another number. But for my case, obviously my number is going to be a point, as opposed to surfaces kind of interacting with each other. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I'm not looking at curved surfaces either. So yeah, it seems cool though. I may look at some more game logic when it comes to 3D stuff, but I'm not too worried about, because I'm not building a 3D game yet. Yeah, I don't know. I've been writing some notes and whatnot, and it was just all ECS, and trying to kind of like rack my brain and wrap my head around how I really want to structure this. Even though, again, I'm just trying to get myself in that mindset, so I don't have to worry about it. It'll be more second nature by the time I'm done even building my first game. So that that mindset's already there when it comes to actually scaling it, and maybe going to a different project that's much bigger than it just being probably a platformer. I may just have a platformer with different levels and whatnot. So I'm just going to keep it simple because, again, I think it's best to keep your first project simple so you won't be discouraged. Yeah. And then, yeah, of course, it's going to be very, programming is very iterative. So, yeah. Did I talk about the error that occurred with the Segfault and whatnot? I don't know. Well, the Segfault actually occurred because there was I was calling a glibc function. I didn't even realize that. Glibc is like a new standard library, C standard library, which was a sys process called close for probably applications and whatnot, and standard applications that run on Linux. And yeah, I actually called that, and then it was obviously reaching past its virtual memory. Oh shit! There's a lot of smoke. I really hope the fire alarm doesn't go off. Oh. Yeah. So I basically called a function that was outside the scope of my particular program, and it also wasn't in my project directory, so assumed it was because I called it within the binary and whatnot. So it looked at that directory is working off of which is under source and whatnot. I'm not sure if this fan is too. It's probably not going to do anything because it's too late. The smoke is already dispersed out through my room. So yeah, I don't know. We'll see. Aside from that, I'll be getting my PC in the next couple of days. Or I already have my PC. Sorry, my dad thought he'd help me out with getting a keyboard and monitor, but he decided to give me my keyboard and monitor back instead because he's a little bit pickier. I kind of like the setup that I had before, and I may get a second monitor for, if I do like Twitch streaming stuff, and so I can actually look at the chat as opposed, so I can have like my main monitor and then my second monitor. I'll keep it simple. I know people like having very extravagant setups, and I'm not really that picky about it. So I mean, I had a decent monitor. I'm not even sure if it was a 4K monitor. I'm not sure. And the refresh rate was like 60. It was standard, like 60 or something. I don't think maybe it was 90. I don't know. And it's HDMI input. I don't think I'm even using what's the other input called? DP? Digital something? I forgot what that stands for. DisplayPort. Yeah, DisplayPort. I'm not using DisplayPort. I'm just using HDMI. So yeah, anyways. We'll see. I'm probably going to get the monitor myself as opposed to my dad because he gave me back my monitor that I sold to him. So that was basically a Christmas gift. And I have a lot of other things that I may get rid of and whatnot because I don't need them anymore. And yeah, this is a lot of fucking smoke. I'm surprised the alarm didn't go off. But yeah, I got distracted again. Yeah, Senator Guild Wars 2 gaming most likely. And yeah, I don't know. Quite a few things to do today. Quite a few things. I'm going to stay here for a second to see if there's anything else I want to talk about. But yeah, I mean, that's basically it. I just want to give an update, and I just want to talk about the error that occurred. And I'm going to try to be a little bit more careful because I pretty much copied and pasted a bunch of text from the internet, and then I kind of like hacked a bunch of random shit together, hoping it would work out. And I refactored it multiple times to make it look good, and which is fine, but sometimes, especially, I have a good launching point now, and every time I modify a method or a component or whatever, I want to make sure to actually run it just to make sure it works and there aren't any errors, because I think that's standard. There's common sense for programming and whatnot. Yeah, there's another word I was thinking of. Common programming etiquette. Know-how. I don't know. Yeah, so... yeah. Fun stuff. Yeah, hope you guys have a good day. Bye.